Well, remember, Seattle still had a downtown core. Everybody came downtown on the weekend to go shopping. The big movie theaters were downtown. So it was very important. My dad at that point owned some cabs, and so he came downtown to work with his cabs. And so you came downtown on the weekends, period. I mean, there were 5 or 6 big department stores downtown. That's where everybody went shopping. And you'd come down, have lunch typically, buy whatever you need to buy. And so there was really a lot of focus that Seattle was the core to these new suburbs that were developing around it.
Pike Place Market.
It was fascinating. Back then it was very rambly and ramshackle, full of interesting stuff. You could roam in there for days. The waterfront was less developed. There were actually real ships backed into the piers. They were unloading cargo. Fishermen brought in their catches right on the waterfront down. So it was really kind of the old style Seattle, which was still in play. And it was really interesting in all fairness. And, and even the department stores, Rhodes and McDougal's and Southwick, and then Frederick and Nelson, which is now Nordstrom's, was the flagship downtown. And people went shopping as sort of the weekend recreation. The First Avenue was the old Skid Row, which in the 20s and 30s had been the whorehouses for the loggers and drinking bars, and that had declined considerably. Pioneer Square was a old neighborhood that once again had fallen to disrepair. Very few businesses located there, and people didn't go there to hang out. So it was kind of interesting because even though these are kind of derelict areas, they were close to downtown and really interesting if you were into prowling around. They still had some very seedy, interesting bars. I didn't go to the bars until I was older, but I was aware of them. And they had this interesting reputation among people who talked about Seattle. Lots of stories from the old days, if you listen carefully, about the bars and the places on First Avenue and Pioneer Square. Yeah, people forget that Seattle was a working class waterfront, and there were thousands of these people, sailors and loggers and truck drivers and people who brought produce into the Pike Place Market. I mean, everything was done by hand in that era, very labor intensive, so there was a huge workforce that made the city work. And these were the neighborhoods where they tended to go drinking. Things were cheap, they didn't make a lot of money. And there was no attempt to be socially acceptable. Yeah, it's always kind of been that way, but remember the east side suburbs were more white because those were some of the wealthier people who started leaving the old neighborhoods of Seattle and starting fresh neighborhoods on the east side. But Seattle was classically mixed then. You had the Asian community on Beacon Hill. It goes back to the 20s. You had the black community in the Central District. And it's an international city, an international port. It's always had that diversity. And there was never any doubt, if one wanted to take a look and be realistic and looking around, that it was a very diverse place and there were lots of different people. Also the economic diversity, because Seattle had the Boeing workers and the wartime industries and this huge mass of labor, which was intrinsic to the day because everything was done by hand. We forget how little mechanization existed in the 40s and 50s compared to today. So you had a workforce that was very, very mixed and very working class. And then you had the moneyed layers of people in Seattle who lived in Magnolia or on Queen Anne, some of the old neighborhoods where the money was at. But I think Seattle's always had a real diversity of people. And I think being a port city and being tied to Alaska are part of that. The gold from Alaska all came to Seattle. Every supply for the Alaska gold rush, you need to remember, all went from Seattle. Seattle took in billions of dollars of real gold in that era, and that was also a part of it. And this wasn't glamour. This was really, stock and trade stuff, guys going up there to mine, and equipment and gear. So it wasn't high-end technology or glamour at all. It was just meat and potatoes trade that enriched the city. And so I think that influence is important as well.